I'd like, first of all, to thank my dear brother Tunç for arranging this very vital event. I cannot recall having been in a room full of Palestinians and pro-Palestinians to that magnitude in the last 2 years. If you try to put together a similar event in Europe, you would expect the federal police to storm through the door at any minute. And you would watch out every word you say, because if you say one word out of context, you could expect a knock on the door by the federal police in the evening as well. It's a very draconian time. Europe is becoming a continent of police states, and these are not my words. These are internal papers in the EU that some European diplomats have leaked, and they themselves acknowledge that there's an increased trend of authoritarianism, crackdown on the pro-Palestinian movement in order to avoid Europe's complicity in this genocide. My brother, Mr. Samir, said a sentence that touched a nerve, was very spot on. He said, we reached the limit of human speech. Words don't mean much of anything anymore. And it is precisely the way to diagnose the situation in Gaza now on 2 levels. Number one, there are no words to describe Gaza. There's a catastrophe, there's genocide, there's dystopia, there's an apocalypse, and then there is Gaza. It's beyond all of these things. Again, these are the words of the United Nations. They come out with periodic reports about what's happening on the ground based on field visits or observations, and they started by describing Gaza as a graveyard for children, or a disaster zone, or an apocalypse, or a catastrophe. At some point, the United Nations declared there are no words to describe Gaza anymore. There are no words in the human vocabulary that can describe what's unfolding on the ground. But we also reached the levels of human speech when it comes to my personal interactions with people on the ground in Gaza. Like early on, I would talk to family, friends, colleagues daily, and we would discuss whatever topic there is, because most of the time I expected that this would be the last time I hear their voices. I lost 2 of my closest friends, and my deepest regret is that I didn't talk to them enough. So early on, I would call people there regularly. We would discuss despair, hope, fear, anxiety, panic, and even wishes of death. When the situation becomes too grim that your first instinct is to say, I wish if I was dead, rather than living through this. But now, there's only silence. All of these words have been said 1,000,000 times. They've become too repetitive that they've lost any weight. They've lost any meaning. They've been hollowed out. It's the same as the word genocide. Israel does a very good job at mimicry, imitation. If you use one word to describe objectively what is unfolding, the Israeli government will vulgarize it out of existence. So you use genocide to describe Gaza, you would be flooded by Israeli officials saying Hamas's attack on October 7th is genocide, the PLO is genocidal, Hamas is genocidal, Arabs are genocidal. They would use genocide over and over and over again until it doesn't mean anything anymore. It's deliberate. It's not coincidental. And because of the silence of the international community, that no matter what you say, I've been in this awkward environment for the last 23 months where I would say I suffer from something called the Forrest Gump syndrome, always the wrong man at the right table. I keep getting invited to these European workshops, seminars, closed-door meetings with officials, members of parliament, foreign ministries, etc. And every time it's like solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through salmon, fish, and potato salad. You're invited to a very luxurious hotel in Geneva or Brussels or Berlin or Madrid or all around Europe, and you're treated to a very nice meal while they ask you, please, Muhammad, describe to us in vivid detail how your family in Gaza is starving to death. And then you go on and on and on with the description. You leave the room. They invite you again 2 weeks later, a month later. You say the exact same things over and over and over again. Nothing changes. And that's the holiness of the words. Basically, the average person in Gaza survived about 5 wars, 15 military operations, which is more precisely described as high-tech killing sprees, and about 2 full-scale ground invasions, 2008 and 2014. That's the average life of the person in Gaza. That's how we measure our age. I personally survived 3 wars, 10 military operations, and 2 ground invasions. And yet none of it, if you combine all of these together, none of it would come close to even describing 1% of what's unfolding right now. Previous Israeli atrocities and assaults on Gaza were aimed at 3 goals, as stated by Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, in his 2017 manifesto. He said, we will give Palestinians 3 options: live here as second-class citizens, or fight back and get killed, or leave. The same terms were articulated by Israel's defense minister on the eve of the occupation, 1967, Moshe Dayan from the Labour Party, left wing. He said, we will tell Palestinians we have no solution. Whoever wants to live here shall live like dogs, otherwise they should leave. And we will see where this process leads us. Maybe in 5 years, 200,000 Palestinians would leave. It's the same terms. And that's why you had basically Israel realizing after 67 they couldn't do another Nakba. They couldn't expel everyone out. But they understood the immediate alternative: make life there as miserable as possible with periodic massacres, atrocities, terror attacks, etc., so that people would have no option but to leave. But Palestinians were not leaving at a fast enough pace. So during the 2 decades of siege on Gaza, about 250,000 Gazans left. It is a major number, but it's not significant for Israel to depopulate the entire area. So now, previous wars were called mowing the lawn, decapitate as many heads as it takes to suppress, to brutalize Palestinians into silence. This time around, it's about mass expulsion. There's no other way of getting around it. That's the core of Israel's Gaza invasion at the moment. Gaza City is the largest remaining urban space, and aerial bombardment is never enough to annihilate a city. You basically need to go in underground with bulldozers and machineries to destroy every standing building. And that's why they're invading Gaza City, coupled with the other solution. So Israel now, they established a concentration camp in Rafah, in an area called Al-Shoka, on the borders with Egypt, in east southern Rafah. If you look at the map, so this is Gaza City right here. Israel established this concentration camp right here on Egypt's borders. And it's run by a drug dealer called Yasser Abu Shabab, with a gang of criminals on the run from authorities. And Israel's final stage of the genocide is mass expulsion of everyone in Gaza into that concentration camp and then into Egypt and beyond. There are 2 questions that Palestinians would ask each other wherever we talk. Number 1, how many family members did you lose? The answer used to be early on in the genocide, it was in the 30, 50, 40, something around that. By now it's in the hundreds. Last time I checked my father's side alone from the family, it was 106, and that was in January. I got a shock by just checking the number. I didn't even dare to read it. The second question is your home still standing? And virtually every single person I know had their homes either bombed, burned to the ground, bulldozed, destroyed, or damaged beyond habitation. But at the same time, you have this undying will amongst Gazans to live. So I was recently talking to a friend in Gaza City, and he was trying to give me hope. He was saying, there's life here. A falafel shop just opened around the corner. There is a bakery around the other corner. Don't worry, we're getting water, we're getting some food. And then I asked, okay, open the camera, show me around. And then he just simply opened his camera and showed me where he's staying. And he's literally staying in a building that was bombed from the top. Half of it is already collapsed. The other half is about to collapse as well. There's no staircase. There's no one living in the building itself, in the tower. So he's living in the ground floor. He basically put some plastic wrapping between 2 pillars of the tower, and he's staying there. And you're literally seeing, as he walked on the street, you're seeing the entire area annihilated. It's an area of high-rise buildings, every single one of them bombed. But you're seeing people burrowing in the rubble and trying to make it as habitable as possible. And there's an undying will to resist as well. There is an insurgency in Gaza that Israel failed to extinguish, no matter how much brutality and violence they used. Take a look at Jabalia, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia. Israel placed it under siege for over 100 days. No food, no water, no electricity. Regular massacres every day, drones, bombardment incessantly. And yet people refused to leave. And resistance was still active there. Until today, the IDF is getting ambushed in these areas. Now moving on to Europe very succinctly. So as I said, I've been in dozens of meetings with European officials. I would categorize them into 4 categories. Number 1 is people who don't want to know, people that are ignorant, They don't want to know, or simply they don't care, to maintain plausible deniability. So at some point I was at the German Foreign Ministry and I was talking to someone and he said something like, I believe the only reason why Israel maintains an occupation is security. And I said, well, I know 700,000 Israeli settlers who would disagree with you. And he didn't understand what I was talking about. He enjoyed the ignorance, the bliss of it. I was recently at a meeting at the European Commission with an advisor to an EU commissioner. And I mentioned the name Yasser Abu Shabab, didn't ring a bell. I mentioned UN reports, they had no idea about it. A European leader that I met last year, he said he compiled UN reports and tried to give it to his colleagues, heads of states, prime ministers, etc. And he said the majority of them refused to even take the UN reports. They said the UN is biased. It's not a trusted source on Israel. They wanted to remain ignorant. They wanted that blissful ignorance. And the second kind of people are people who know what is happening. They know it intimately, but they don't dare talk about it. The biggest betrayal of Gaza is not satanic evil, but it's a mix of cowardice, careerism, cynicism, cupidity, self-interest, racism. So, for example, I was once in Geneva, and the woman that was seated next to me was a senior official in the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and she literally tells me this. She looks me in the eye and says, our talking points are being drafted in Tel Aviv. They come out of Tel Aviv, not from us. The Israelis hand us and say, you as the Swiss Foreign Ministry, you need to say 1, 2, 3, 4. And I was very upset about it, and I protested, and I said, we have our own diplomatic service to articulate our talking points. So why do we need to get it from Israel? And then she followed it up with another sentence. She said, I was told if you speak and protest and object to it publicly, you will never have a job. Not just the foreign ministry, but not even at a grocery store. And I heard that sentence over and over again in mainstream media, from journalists in CNN, New York Times, The Guardian, like whatever you name it. All of them are saying, if I speak up, I'll never have a job. I'll lose my job. One of them recently was talking to me, a journalist from a major American newspaper, and he had tears in his eyes because his own wife and daughter cannot stand the sight of him. His own wife and daughter are shaming him every single day. They're saying, you're a coward. You're completely complicit. You're not showing up to the demonstrations. And then he said, but if I speak up, if I go to one protest for Gaza, I will lose my job immediately. And then with those people, I once went to meet a top European leader last year. Before the meeting, I spent weeks preparing. I called colleagues in Gaza, in the West Bank, outside, in Europe, in the US, all over. I wanted to impress the guy. I thought in my head, in the back of my mind, that if I managed to leave a good impression on this guy today, things might change. And then I walked into the room, I sat down, and then he started talking. His first sentence was, we are completely irrelevant, we are completely useless. And then he circled his personal tablet around the table, and he showed satellite imagery that the EU has been collecting of Gaza, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, and nothing was standing. I literally kept zooming on and on and on to recognize anything. I couldn't recognize anything. And that was 12 months ago, or even 14 months ago. It was in July last year. But as soon as the meeting was finished, like in the meeting, he said, Europe is completely complicit. We are very kind people. We give Israel the bombs in the evening, but we give you bandages and food in the morning, so that if Israel kills you, you wouldn't die on an empty stomach, and if you survive, you can plaster your wounds. He was very honest. But as soon as the meeting was over, that's the end of it. You would never hear him saying it publicly, until they leave office, of course. And the third kind of people that I met are people who are, like to say it, put it mildly, they're just psychopathically evil. People who know exactly what's happening, but they take the extra mile of making Israel's case. One of them was the foreign minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock. She went to visit Israel, I think in October or November 2023. And before she went there, I was in correspondence with one of her immediate advisors, one of the officials of the ministry. And I told him, look, she leads a feminist-led foreign policy. She leads a human rights-led foreign policy. Here's your talking point. Women in Gaza in their 20s are having their uteruses removed, the uterus removed to stop post-birth bleeding, and without anesthesia. It doesn't get more atrocious than this. And then I trusted that he would convey the point. After her visit, she writes this on Twitter, literally. She goes on Twitter and she writes, I genuinely believe Israel deeply cares about the civilian population in Gaza. This is what distinguishes the humanity of the Israelis from the monster terrorists they are fighting against. Psychopathy. And then she stood in front of a podium and made an argument in the parliament that hospitals and schools in Gaza are legitimate targets. The last time a major European leader stood and made the same point about hospitals was Benito Mussolini in the war in Ethiopia. They were targeting Red Cross facilities systematically. And you're seeing it basically like there was a European official that told me to my eye, she said, there are leaders out there that want the genocide to happen. They wouldn't be upset if Gaza is gone because they see you Palestinians as an economic burden, as a hungry mouse. You keep asking for food, you keep asking for money, for aid constantly. And it's never done, it's never finished. So if Gaza is gone, it wouldn't be the worst thing for them. And the fourth kind of people that I conclude with are people who know exactly what's happening and are trying to mobilize under the table as much as possible. There was a German official of all people that told me, if you want us to move, you need to stand outside my ministry and protest day and night. Don't leave, just stand there, block the ministry, keep protesting there. Go to the EU court, to the EU High Court, and sue us there, take us to court. Drag our public officials into court, otherwise they will never move. And he was literally begging civil society to take him and his superiors to court. And those people are trying to mobilize as much as possible under the surface. Like in different European foreign ministries, even in the US, there's now literally a group on WhatsApp of officials from different European, American, etc. agencies that are just discussing Gaza. There's similar WhatsApp groups for people working in CNN, in The Guardian, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, literally like groups of people that are frustrated with what's happening, livid about what's going on, and are trying to mobilize. And the best way you can help them is keep up the momentum, keep shaming them publicly, take them to court. The activism, the mobilization, change is always very slow until it's not. I learned that lesson from people who worked regularly on advocacy and mass mobilization. Change is always painfully slow until one day it immediately, everything falls into order. You saw it in Syria over a decade, and then overnight, everything is gone. Bashar Assad is over. And that's how we ended up with recognition. European governments, before October 7th, before the genocide, if you tried to raise to one of them the prospect of recognition, or imposing sanctions on Smotrich and Ben Gvir, or imposing sanctions on settlers, or boycotting Israeli settlement products, they would laugh in your face. It was completely insane. It was unthinkable for them to do this. And now you're having them do all of these things and still being shamed and still being told that this is not enough. Things are changing. You're literally seeing a huge dam that is cracked all over and is about to collapse. It's about to flood. But the more you slow down your activism, the more time you give them to plaster the cracks in the dam. The more time you give them to whitewash and make the world forget the genocide. Like Israel's and Europe's and the US's gamble on the genocide in Gaza is basically that as soon as it's over, they will try everything to make the world forget it. They will tell you, now is the time of healing. Now is the time of progress. Why are you filled with hatred? Why are you an extremist? Why do you look back in history? That's the same thing they did about the invasion of Iraq. Who talks about Iraq nowadays? Nobody. It's past. Who talks about Afghanistan or Vietnam? They're very good at that kind of stuff. And they expect it to go the same way. Who talks about the the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982? The American president called it at the time, Donald Reagan. He said, this is a Holocaust about Lebanon. 15,000 people were killed. Now you have in Gaza about 4 times as much or even more. So their gamble is to make you forget. But the only way to fight it back is to keep it up. Israel now understands. I read Israeli newspapers as part of my work twice a day, 16 newspapers, 2 hours in the morning, 2 in the evening. And they are complaining around the hour that their propaganda is collapsing and they have no way of salvaging it. And they try to come up with all different sorts of explanations. So they say, okay, our propaganda is collapsing because Hamas is running a highly sophisticated propaganda campaign. And I'm like, name a single Hamas leader that can put 2 sentences in English coherently. And they're like, no, our propaganda is collapsing because Iran is running a propaganda campaign on Hamas's behalf. I'm like, if Iran can run such a sophisticated campaign, they would have run it for themselves. They are the most sanctioned country on the face of the earth. But the reason why Israel's propaganda has collapsed is because they have become so extreme, so genocidal. You see it in the polls. Israelis are some of the most polled people on the face of earth. Every thought that crosses an Israeli's mind needs to be polled, needs to be studied and analyzed. And you see it. 82% of the Israeli public supports mass expulsion from Gaza. 47% supports outright killing everyone, every man, child, woman in every area the IDF goes into. 62% are saying there are no innocents in Gaza. And this genocidal fever is the reason why the propaganda collapsed. They made the job easy for you because in the old days, an Israeli diplomat, all he had to say was, we support the two-state solution and peace. The Palestinians don't. We're not the problem. The Palestinians are. If you get an Israeli official to say this word for word in front of a camera, he will not have a job in the afternoon. Like right after he walks out of that interview, he will be fired immediately for saying we support peace. They cannot afford to pretend to care for Palestinians because now it's a career suicide. Like one of Netanyahu's spokespeople was a guy called Ilan Levy. And Ilan Levy at some point, I will conclude briefly, Ilan Levy at some point he makes a tweet where he says, I believe people in Gaza should stay in Gaza, but in return we should cancel UNRWA, the UN agency for refugees, because if Gazans want to stay in Gaza so bad, that means they're not refugees, so we should cancel UNRWA. And then he gets lynched, attacked nonstop by Israelis. He had to delete the tweet and apologize and say, no, I support the mass expulsion from Gaza. You had even the head of the Israeli left-wing party, Yair Golan, the head of the Meretz Labor, the Democrats, he's asked on TV, what do you think about the transfer of people from Gaza? And he says, it's a wonderful idea. Of course we support that in the Democrats. The propaganda collapsed because they cannot pretend to care anymore. So this is like in terms of entrepreneurship or in the business world, they would call this marketing gold, because now you have pure gold to dismantle the Israeli narrative completely, irrevocably. In Germany, for example, or in Europe, much of the sympathy towards Gaza is about the atrocities happening now. But most people don't know the background of it. They don't know the history. So in their heads, Israel's cause is a just cause, but they are doing some wrong stuff. But this is your time right now to educate and show that it's rotten from the get-go, that the rot is a cornerstone of the foundation of this project of dispossession, displacement, and ethnically cleansing of Palestinians. The final point, Kaya Kalas, the EU High Representative, she went to Israel recently. It was her first visit to the Middle East at all. First time she's ever been to the Middle East. She was the Prime Minister of Estonia, never knew anything about the Middle East. And then she goes there. The Israelis take her to the Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, and she walks out with one lesson. She says, the victims have become the oppressors. And the Israelis panic. They're like, this is not the lesson you're supposed to come out of this place with. And she says, the victims have become the victimizers. And then her advisors told me that she thinks of the Israeli government as obnoxious, pathological liars, psychopathic. She cannot stand the side of them. She cannot stand Gideon Sa'ar. But then 2 weeks later, I see her with Gideon Sa'ar in a photo op with his sweaty hands all over, and they're shaking hands and praising shared values. And ever since, the backlash she got for this is what forced her into silence. Her own advisors are saying, oh God, these emails that we keep getting from concerned citizens, they're driving them insane. They are setting the mood. The Israelis are very good at this. Every time a newspaper publishes one article that is critical of Israel, they would get 10,000 angry emails from Israelis or pro-Israelis saying, nah, you're going too far, you're biased. We need to do the same thing. And this is your time to show that the strongest marketing campaign against Israel right now is lying, pathological liars. Just point out the lies they've told systematically. You dismantle everything else. Thank you.